Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hi, I'm Dan Rundy. I'm the Senior Vice President here at CSIS. Today, we're going to be doing an exit interview with Carl Gershman, founding president of the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm really happy to be doing this with my friend and colleague, Elizabeth Hoffman, who's Director of Government Affairs here at CSIS. Elizabeth comes to us from the NED recently. It was a great get for CSIS that Elizabeth agreed to come to join us at CSIS, and it was really important that I wanted to do this with her. It was fitting that we did this in partnership. Carl Gershman is a great American and someone I really admire. He's going to retire from his post after almost 4 decades of extraordinary leadership at the National Endowment for Democracy. He built the NED from the ground up and helped extend its influence and support of freedom to millions of people around the world. If we take the long view, if we take the 40-year view, the world's a freer place. I'm not going to sit here and say that there haven't been a lot of setbacks. There have been some significant setbacks in the last 15 years. But if we take the long view, the world's a freer, healthier, more prosperous place. And certainly the last 18 months haven't been a bunch of ice cream sundaes and rainbows either. So let's just be frank. But we have to be optimistic, and we have to be persistent, and we have to work at these challenges for a long period of time. The NED has done that, and Carl Gershman has led that. So I'm really pleased to hand the floor over to my friend Elizabeth Hoffman to make some opening remarks. Elizabeth?
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm particularly pleased to be here today with my former boss, Carl Gershman. Prior to joining CSIS, as Dan mentioned, I served as the Director of Government Relations for the NED and had the pleasure of working closely with Carl during that time. The establishment of NED over 35 years ago demonstrates what incredible things that Republicans and Democrats can do when they come together with common cause. In this case, the cause was supporting democratic movements in the world in the height of the Cold War. In 1983, Congress passed and President Ronald Reagan signed the NED Act, which laid the foundation for the endowment and authorized the organization to receive federal funds. The NED is a grant-making organization with the sole mission of fostering democratic movements and activists around the world. This is done both through direct grants to civil society organizations and through what are called the 4 core institutes of the endowment: the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and the Solidarity Center. NED's 4 core institutes are the primary implementing partners and represent the key pillars of America's civil society: the 2 political parties, business, and labor. This unique structure was laid out in the NED Act over 30 years ago and persists today. In 1984, Congress appropriated just $18 million for the NED. In 2021, Congress appropriated $300 million for the NED. This tremendous growth is a testament to the bipartisan support for both building democratic societies around the world, but also for the institution that you, Carl, built. I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit more about the unique structure of the NED and how it's positioned in DC's foreign policy community. When the endowment was established, a very deliberate decision was made by policymakers to separate it from the US government. What was the genesis of that decision, and how has it shaped NED's relationship with the larger US foreign policy community?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Great to see you again. We're happy to give you the CSIS. It's because we're very close with CSIS, so we're giving a marvelous gift to CSIS. In the beginning, it was not clear, after Reagan gave the Westminster Address on June 8, 1982, it was not clear whether the NED would be a public or a private initiative. There were 2 proposals. One was called Project Democracy, which was for a governmental initiative through USIA. The other was the Democracy Program, which was the bipartisan study group that eventually became the NED. And in 1983, Charlie Wick, who was the head of USIA, went before Senator Chuck Percy's Foreign Relations Committee to try to defend Project Democracy. It was a $65 million initiative, and he really did not, from what I heard, I was not there, didn't do a great job of explaining it. It was a hard thing to explain. How would you promote democracy? Nobody knew, and the act didn't really spell that out. And because of that, Percy, who was supposed to have been original board member of the NED, he was up for re-election. He decided to go back to Illinois, run for re-election, and he withdrew from the NED. Orrin Hatch eventually took his place on the NED board because we had Dante Fascell as a House member who was our champion in the House. So Project Democracy went nowhere, although there's an interesting sequel to it that I'll explain in a moment. It was put on a shelf somewhere, and I didn't know who picked it up. The Democracy Program was a bipartisan study group, which really brought together a community of people, Democrats and Republicans, and prepared a report for Dante Fascell in the House of Representatives. Fascell had wanted to do this going back to the 1960s, and he tried again in the 1970s, and for the first time now he had a bipartisan coalition after Reagan's Westminster address to do something like this. So this was a real opportunity. And what happened was that in the late 1970s, the German political party foundations, called the Stiftungen, this is what they were, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, they played a very important role in the transition to democracy in Portugal and Spain. In Portugal, the military had fallen in 1974. In Spain, Franco died in 75. And there were transitions taking place in the Iberian Peninsula. Sam Huntington later identified the fall of the military in 1974 in Portugal as the start of the global third wave of democratization. And so at that time, there were people around, George Agri especially, who headed something called the American Political Foundation, who said, we should do something like that. The United States needs an equivalent for the German political party foundations. And that was what became the core of the Democracy Program study. And so they created these two-party institutes with they meaning the parties. These were private groups that created everything. Congress did not create anything. They authorized the funding for privately incorporated entities, and we were the line item in the bill. The funding was to come to us. And the original idea is that we would be a funding mechanism for these institutes. Labor at the time, was the only private institution in the United States that had a large international program. After Vietnam, there was a lot of withdrawal from international affairs, and Labor had 3 large regional institutes for Latin America, Asia, and Africa that were funded by AID. Labor was the giant. It was also strongly anti-communist, and so it had Republican support as well as Democratic support. And so Labor was, of the original $18 million, Elizabeth, Labor had a $13.8 million earmark in that, if you can believe that, leaving very little for anyone else. And the Congress had zeroed out the party institutes because they were controversial. And they sort of folded in the Business Institute to balance Labor. So in the beginning, NED started out with, in a sense, a very controversial organization with limited funding, skewed toward labor. There was always the thought that maybe we would do something in addition to the institutes, and a little bit of money was left over for what we called small grants. They used to talk back in those days of the whales and the minnows were the small grants. But since that time, let me just say that the net has changed in 2 fundamental ways. The small grants have grown to more than half of the funding right now, and we make 2,000 grants a year. 1,700 of those grants are small grants to NGOs all over the world. And also, we do things ourselves. We were always grant making, but we do what are called activities, publishing a Journal of Democracy, having a fellowship program, creating the World Movement for Democracy, to become a center for activism of this kind around the world. But back then, NED was controversial. It wasn't just that it was seen as a Reagan anti-communist crusade. The very fact that it was private, a privately incorporated entity, but receiving a line item congressional appropriation was controversial. A lot of people said, if you want to get public money, be part of the government. You shouldn't be private. But Congress wanted us to be private because we would be supporting private groups, and it wouldn't be appropriate for the government to be helping those groups. So you needed some kind of a non-governmental mechanism. But what the NED Act did was it separated us from the executive branch. And the NED was seen, as potentially controversial in other ways. It was a kind of Reagan anti-communist crusade. It was a neoconservative organization. It would interfere in elections abroad. It was democracy, which was political, whereas human rights, and associated with Reagan, whereas human rights had been non-political and associated with Jimmy Carter, in the view of some people who were critics of the NED at the time. Some people talked about, connections to the CIA, so we were put under the Freedom of Information Act. And the institutes were controversial in the beginning. The structure, these four big U.S. institutions, even though the institutes that the NED funded were not formally a part of these institutions, the people in Congress said, why should the taxpayer fund that? These big institutions should fund it. And then the party institutes, you heard language like boondoggles and junketeering. I mean, it would not be a serious operation. This was the great fear that people had. So in the beginning, we had a job to do. We had to define what this would be, and we did. And we adopted something called the Statement of Principles and Objectives, and in it we addressed the very question that you raised, private versus public. And we said that the NED must stand apart from the immediate foreign policy disputes and represent a consistent, a bipartisan, and a long-term approach to strengthening democracy around the world that would be supported by successive administrations. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, we also had to convince people that we were going to be pro-democracy more than anti-communist, that we were going to be pluralistic, and that we would support democracy in very different kinds of situations, whether they were potentially transitional situations like in Argentina or Chile, whether they were countries that people saw, poor countries that had a long way to go to achieve democracy, or communist countries. We said, yes, we would. We would support people. While we would focus on the real opportunities in transitional countries, we would continue to, we would not neglect people, as we said in this statement, who hold aloft the flame of freedom in closed societies. This was our spirit. This was what we believed in, and this is what we did. We still had to tell our story, and maybe I'll conclude with this point as an opening statement. I mentioned before that there was a sequel to the Project Democracy story. And the NED was controversial because people didn't understand what it was. And it was the Sandinistas in Nicaragua once called us. In 1987, we had nobody. We were just struggling to survive. They called us the most coherent attempt by imperialism to penetrate the world ideologically. That's what the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Central America was the big issue at the time. So we had to tell our story. And then what happened was the Iran-Contra scandal broke in October of 1986. And we had obviously nothing, didn't even know about it or what was going on. But then in January of 1987, the New York Times came with a lead story saying that Ollie North was running a support operation for the Contras in Nicaragua and trying to sell arms to Iran and doing it under Project Democracy. And that this was somehow connected to the NED. This was our covert side. The project, or we were its open side. The Economist said they were our covert side. The New York Times said we had nothing to do with it. I never saw these people. But this was very damaging. And when it happened in January of 1987, I said, we got to tell our story. And we had already been, almost 3 years in operation. We were supporting some real heroes around the world already with very little, but in Chile, in South Africa, in the Philippines, in Poland, in the Soviet Union, in China. We were supporting people already and finding the freedom fighters around the world. So we brought everybody to Washington, including great scholars like Sam Huntington, Seymour Martin Lipset, Juan Linz, Larry Diamond. And we had Bill Bradley and Senator Lugar speaking. I mean, it was a glorious occasion. It was our coming out party. And then Schultz had us all over to the State Department on the 7th floor in the Indian Treaty Room, where he congratulated every activist who was there and took a picture with them. And it was sort of a glorious opening. And and that meeting, maybe I'll conclude with this, that international meeting, we held 4 subsequent international meetings in Washington, but eventually those international meetings evolved into what became the World Movement for Democracy, which was something that we founded in the world's largest democracy, India, in February of 1999. So it took a while, and I might just note that in the Statement of Principles and Objectives, we put a paragraph that we were going to do something like that. So we had the vision from the very beginning. It just took 15 years.
Well, okay, Carl, so since you took the helm at the NED 35 years ago, more than 35 years ago, there's been, as I said earlier, there's been a tremendous amount of progress in the world on democracy, human rights, and governance. What role has the NED played, and can you point to some recent examples where NED support has made an impact?
Look, in the beginning, it was a great period. I had mentioned before Sam Huntington and the third wave of democratization. We didn't know it. I mean, when Reagan went to Westminster, he talked about a democratic revolution, but nobody knew there was a democratic revolution in the world in 1982. It really only started gathering momentum afterwards. We came into existence really operationally in 1984, and we caught the cresting of the third wave of democratization. Huntington had this theory that you have waves of democratization, and there are international trends. Started with our own revolution, the first wave. The second wave was after World War II, when India, Costa Rica, and other countries, developing countries, started becoming democracies. But waves of democracy are followed by reverse waves. But this wave had a tremendous impact on politically in the United States, because at the time, in the late 1980s, there was a sharp left-right split in the Congress and in the country between people who wanted to support friendly tyrants against Castroite anti-democratic leftists. President Kennedy once said, there are 3 options in descending order of preference. There's democracy, there's authoritarianism, which is friendly to the United States geopolitically, and there's a Castroite left. And you want the first, but you shouldn't get rid of the second until you're sure you're not going to get the third. And what happened with the third wave of democratization was that there was now a third way, a democratic third way. And Shirley Christian wrote at the time that democracy promotion was the way to avoid the painful choice between military intervention on behalf of, a friendly authoritarian like the Shah, or like Somoza in Nicaragua, or Batista in Cuba, between those kinds of autocrats and just standing aside as Castro seizes power in Cuba. Here you have a real alternative, and that ended this left-right division. Other things happened. I mean, that once the Cold War was over, there were people who started saying, who needs this anymore? And we didn't realize at the time, really, because this was a very heady time, that there were already signals for a reverse wave. I mean, in 1989, on the very day that you had the breakthrough elections in Poland, June 4th, 1989, that was when Tiananmen Square happened. And the Chinese cracked down on this democratic protest, not just in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, in 400 cities across China. But that ended that. But then there was the Rwanda genocide, there was Bosnia. And then in a way, most significantly, at the end of the 90s, in September of 1999, Putin took over. And he took over in the most brutal way. I mean, this was really the restoration of KGB power. And there were apartment bombings. David Satter has written about this. There were apartment bombings in which 300 people were killed, and they were blaming it on Chechen terrorists, when it was then revealed, although a lot of the witnesses were killed, but it was revealed that this was done by the FSB. 300 people were killed, and because one of the apartment bombings was preempted, it didn't work, and when they called the phone number, it was an FSB phone number of the people who were waiting outside into a plane. And even Satter has written about all of this. But these were all precursors. And then 9/11 happened. and the war on terrorism, and the U.S., getting bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, where Putin said, this will not happen again. This is where the term color revolutions comes from, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. We will not permit this, and we're going to pass NGO laws to cut off all international assistance and crack down. And you had the financial crisis after that. And you had this, the beginning of a really negative trend that accumulated and grew worse until we, the past decade, the past 15 years, there's been a steady decline, according to Freedom House, in political and civil liberties around the world.
But Carl, it's not been all bad. Talk about your work in Sudan and Armenia.
Look, I believe that there is a tension in the world, and it's an interesting tension, between what you might call the democratic recession. That's now Larry Diamond even uses the term reverse wave. It's gotten that bad. And democratic resilience. And you've seen it in 2018, when we were meeting as a world movement for democracy in Senegal. You had the opening in Ethiopia. You had the opening in Armenia. You had the opening in Malaysia. The following year, as a miracle, you had this incredible opening in Sudan, as you say, which we thought it was going to be a bloodbath in Sudan. And yet it was a breakthrough to a negotiated transition, and it hasn't. It's sort of, these transitions have really gone backwards in Malaysia and in Ethiopia, not yet in Armenia, even though in Armenia, with the Nagorno-Karabakh war, Armenia is under great pressure, but still it has not gone backwards, which is quite remarkable. And Sudan continues forward, but it's really, really tough. And Larry Diamond pointed out.
But Carl, it is fair to say, from when you walked in the door the first day of the job to today, it's a freer world still.
It's a freer world, but with Freedom House has just downgraded India, which was the second largest country in the world, and so now a majority of the people are not living in free countries. The majority of the large countries are no longer democracies. There are a lot of negative trends. And this built with what we call resurgent authoritarianism in the mid-teens, and then the rise of illiberal populism and liberal democracy in the late teens. These were, and sort of the retreat of the West, and the West was preoccupied with its own problems, including the United States. We lost our voice, we lost our commitment. I can remember, this is sort of an interesting moment. I can remember in 1995, when we were having these big conferences. This was the last of the big conferences, and we used to give our Democracy Award at these conferences. And I remember at that conference, we gave it to a human rights leader from Rwanda, where the genocide had just taken place. We gave it to Sergio Aguayo, who was the leader of the civil society movement in Mexico, which had just gone through an important transition. And we gave it to Sergei Kovalyov and Elena Bonner, the widow of Sakharov from Russia, which was then Russia. McCain gave the award to Kovalyov. And it was a beautiful moment. And the great political sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset was there. And his widow told me that he was weeping during the event, And Marty was worried because we were in trouble at that time. In Congress, people were saying, who needs the net anymore? The world loves us now. We can let AID do the job. You don't need NET anymore. There are no tough cases. NET was an institution built for the hard cases. The world's not that way anymore. We don't need you anymore. And so he said, anything I can do to help? I said, Marty, write an article. So he did write an article, and I still quote this article, because he was trying to tell the Congress, look, the struggle between authoritarianism and democracy did not begin with the Cold War. He has talked about in the 19th century, all the people who were fighting for freedom in Europe, Louis Kossuth in Hungary, Mazzini in Italy, they looked to America as the beacon of freedom against authoritarianism, which at that time was monarchical systems. But it was before the Cold War. And then you had the Cold War. And then the Cold War was over. And Marty said that struggle between democracy and authoritarianism is permanent. It continues. And in every country in the world, he said, in the 1990s, he was writing in 95, there was a pro-democracy party and a pro-authoritarian party. There was a pro-American party and an anti-American party. And the United States should not abandon the field of battle in this ongoing struggle. And then what happened, of course, as the period progressed, that battle got sharper and sharper, and the authoritarian forces got stronger and stronger, and the democratic forces were in retreat. And we entered into a period of democratic recession, and even Larry Diamond has now used the term reverse wave, where there are significantly more backsliding countries than there are countries moving forward. And we're at a moment now, and we have to think hard about this, is can we reverse this? Can we reverse this?
So Carl, I want to ask, you talked about some of the toughest places,
Right.
and Ned has a long history of supporting democracy in those really challenging places like Cuba, Belarus, North Korea. Over the past 2 years, we've seen, just in the past few months, we've seen protests in Cuba. We've seen massive uprisings in Belarus against Lukashenko. Unfortunately, the North Korean regime at this point appears fairly resilient. What is the prospect for democratic breakthrough? Because even though we've seen protests, we haven't seen democratic breakthrough. So what's the prospect? How can we help them achieve?
Elizabeth, when the first day I arrived at the Ned, April 30th, 1984, a long time ago, Elizabeth, more than 37 years ago, who was greeting me but Vladimir Bukovsky, the Soviet dissident. He had been let out of the Soviet Union, actually exchanged for a Chilean communist, Luis Carvalhan, in 1976. And he established a close relationship with the AFL-CIO, who were his main supporters, and I got to know him. And he saw my coming to Ned as very important. So he wrote a letter, which I received on my first day, trying to explain the world to me and trying to explain communism to me. And I'll never forget it. He wanted me to understand that there is a process of erosion that take place in totalitarian regimes. And the Soviet Union at the time, it had Stalin.
In 84,
He wrote this in 84. The Soviet Union had Stalin, who died in 53, but this was real totalitarianism. It's what Xi is trying to impose in China today. Totalitarianism, that means no spaces, everything controlled by the center. But then these things, they erode. And you could see at that time in 1984, the erosion had taken place in a drastic way in a country like Poland. And he charted the stages of erosion. Nobody knew at the time that the Soviet Union was so close to a collapse. But he was trying to say that regimes erode. So take the countries you're talking about. When we started in a country like Cuba, the only thing we could support was a project by Armando Valladares, who had been in prison for 20 years, who was close to Bukovsky, and who created committees in Europe to try to support human rights in Cuba. There was nothing we could do in Cuba. There were a few dissident intellectuals in Cuba. Look at Cuba today. And you can trace this since 1984. Look at Cuba today. Just a week ago, there were people in the streets across the country. In 1994, there was an uprising during the special period. It was a difficult economic period for Cuba after they lost all the support from the Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union collapsed. And they had something called the Malacanazo, where there was, hundreds of people near the water in Havana.
The Malecón, yeah.
Yeah, the Malecón. And that's where the demonstrations was, and so it got that name. And Castro came down and tried to quiet them and so forth. And they're saying today now these uprisings are more than anything Cuba has seen since 1994. No, this is much more. This is all over the country. You have things like this song, Patria y Vida, which is a repudiation of Castro and Che Guevara, which was my homeland or death.
Yeah, Patria o Muerte, right? So yeah. Patria y Vida.
And that's become...
It's a hit song, right?
That's the anthem. It's been downloaded millions and millions of times. It's the anthem for the opposition. When people want to say where they stand in Cuba, I'm with Patria y Vida. And there's the San Isidro movement. And this is spreading, which are musicians and artists. This is spreading all over the country. We don't know where this is going to go, but it's different. Compare that to what it was. And you can take North Korea. I can remember at our board meetings in the 1990s, we had two board members. One of them who had a CSIS connection, Freddie Clay, Dr. Freddie Clay, who was a very dear personal friend of mine. Another was Congressman Steve Solarz. They said, get into North Korea, get into North Korea. How do you get into North Korea? You know, it was the most closed country in the world. Then one day in 1996, we got a pamphlet from an organization called the Citizens Alliance for Human Rights in North Korea. I didn't know it at the time, but a group for human rights in North Korea, established by the fellow, Reverend Benjamin Yoon, who had been the head of Amnesty International in South Korea during the fight against the military dictatorship, and then made the transition to one of the rare people in South Korea who made the transition to fighting for democracy in North Korea. And we started connecting with them, and we had a first major international conference in 1999. I gave a speech at that conference called Ending the Silence. Before you knew it, through their work and through the others who were starting to mobilize, you had a UN Special Rapporteur, you eventually had a UN Commission of Inquiry. You started breaking the information blockade through broadcasting information in, information out, because that totalitarian regime needs a blockade of information. People started leaving North Korea for the first time, 2,500 a year, but this built up, and you then had groups established, defector organizations, NGOs. When Trump gave his State of the Union address in 2018, and he recognized somebody in the gallery, it was a North Korean defector who had lost an arm and a leg during the famine in the 1990s when he collapsed. They were trying to get some corn off a train. He collapsed. The train went over his arm and leg, and he survived. He survived, and he then made it across the border with others. And when Trump recognized him, he held up his crutches. You know, he is now a member of the parliament in South Korea. And you have, so you have defectors, and somebody like his name was Ji Sung-ho. You have somebody, Tae Young-ho, who had been deputy ambassador for North Korea in the United Kingdom. And he defected. And there are elites that want to defect. And now he's in the parliament in South Korea. And he wrote a big memoir. Things are breaking down in North Korea, is what I'm saying. It's not a matter of resilience, it's a matter of erosion. And the NED has a very, very strong grants program. You know, if Fred were alive today, and Steve, they would be proud. We have a very strong grants program supporting all of this, the human rights work, the information, broadcasting, and news, the defector organizations, 9 of them that we support, and then even a transitional justice organization that is gathering information to prepare for the transitional justice process that will take place in North Korea when the regime falls, which it will. And everybody knows that it will. And finally, one word about Belarus. You know, this is the last dictatorship in Europe. Lukashenko has been hanging on. But what happened...
When I look up the word thug in the dictionary, there's a picture of Lukashenko.
Dan, there are thugs all over the world.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we're an anti-thug organization. Yeah. You could say we're a democracy organization, we're an anti-thug organization. He's a thug. And in those elections that took place on August 9th
of
2020,
yeah,
hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, a stolen election. This was, as I called it in a speech back then, a nation reborn. It started with culture, it started with art, it started with language, which actually Lukashenko permitted, because he was sort of trying to play a game, you know, looking to Europe.
Belarusian identity.
Yeah,
Belarus
exactly.
identity, yeah.
He permitted that. And all of a sudden, this cultural revolution that took place led to the birth of a nation and that uprising, that rebellion for democracy. And this is a nation reborn. And again, Lukashenko is not long for this world. Believe me, he will fall too. So that's where we can derive
your lips
hope.
To God's ears.
No. There's no support there, and Putin is, you know, he's a declining power. He runs a declining power.
I know.
Eventually, this is going to happen. Eventually, this is going to happen. But, you know, I don't know when.
Okay, but in Elizabeth, in our lifetime, we're going to see the end of the North Korean regime?
Oh, yes, I think so.
The end of the Cuban regime?
look what's happening now.
I agree.
I mean, look what's happening now. This is unprecedented. I mean, look, regimes can hang on, and they'll use all sorts of violence and so forth. But Cuba's a little different. And then, you need intelligence, you need activity at lots of different levels, And then you'll have splits over this, and is it going to be a crash landing or a soft landing? And, liberals always want a soft landing. The conservatives want a crash landing. We don't know. Soft landings are good if you can do it, but you have to have somebody to negotiate with. You need a round table like you had in Poland in 1989. There has to be a split in the military in Chile. There might be. In Cuba. There might be. Because they're not going anywhere. But that takes, you got to have a diplomatic angle here as well. And you've got to have, you have to have sanctions. You have to have a broad policy. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is in town in Washington today. And we met with her, and she's meeting with everybody. And, she feels that there's hope here and that, we have to stand with them and we have to bring the Europeans along. And there's a struggle taking place here. But it's a struggle that can be won.
All right, so you referenced earlier the Freedom House 2021 Freedom in the World Report, and it's been our 15th consecutive year of declining global freedom. You've talked a little bit about why is that happening, but what can be done to turn the tide? And one of the things Elizabeth and I are hoping you're going to do, you're going to take a senior advisor role here at CSIS, and we're thrilled you've agreed to do that, is I think one of the things we want you to help us with and help the world with is putting some ideas together, what we need to do to push back against that. What do we need to do to push back against this?
Well, look, it's fortunate that our president cares about things like this,
It really helps.
He talks about the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. Yeah. He talks about it repeatedly. He talks about that struggle and the need to fight this battle. He's talked about, and I think this is going to happen before the end of the year, he's talked about convening a summit of democracies, a summit for democracy, a summit for democracy. He said that he wants to make corruption a key issue here. Now, that's extremely significant because we're talking not about just petty corruption. If you're talking about kleptocracy, Putin, look at Navalny's film on Putin's palace, $40 billion of stolen money. And our Congress, at the end of 2020, in the National Defense Authorization Act, had a provision outlawing anonymous shell companies where they park their money. And Biden has talked and written about, terminating illicit bank accounts where they park their money. They launder their money, and then they use it not only to buy expensive apartments abroad and to maintain their power at home and to build Putin's palace internally, but they try to infect and corrupt our own democracy with this money. And if the democracies can get together and deny the use of the international financial system to kleptocrats, it will have a devastating effect on regimes like Putin's. Right now, they have their cake and eat it too, And they can use the West. They can use the financial system to launder their money, which is stolen money. It's stolen money from the people. And believe me, that's the main issue of oppositions in all of these countries. That's the main issue of Navalny in Russia.
Corruption.
Corruption. Stealing, not just petty corruption. I'm talking about billions and billions and billions.
I think this is an out-of-date statistic, but the World Economic Forum gathered, looking at sort of a meta set of surveys. It was the issue of corruption was a top 3 issue in something like 100 countries.
Well, there was a statistic not long ago that, regimes were overthrown in 10% of the world's countries because of corruption. That's what stimulates these. There are some other issues that can stimulate an uprising, but essentially it's people protesting against corrupt, not only ineffective government, but government that steals from the people.
There was, they have these meta data gathering exercises at the United Nations, and they gathered about 5 years ago the most commonly used words in Spanish on Twitter. And the 3 words were corruption, education, and inequality, in that order.
Well, okay. The second two is what has to be promoted in order to, if a regime in fact is overthrown as a result of an uprising against corruption, you got to rebuild after that. You got to rebuild. I used to work for a civil rights leader by the name of Bayard Rustin. You may remember, he organized the March on Washington. And I was a little bit too young for that, but I started working for him 5 years after that. And shortly after the March on Washington, he wrote an article for Commentary magazine.
Yeah, sure.
And it was called From Protest to Politics. From Protest to Politics. And we talked about that when, and Elizabeth will remember this phrase, from protest to, and everybody at the NED started picking this up. Because when you have these protests, how do you move from protest to politics? In the case of what Bayard was talking about back then, it wasn't enough to outlaw Jim Crow and then to have civil rights legislation that made equal employment and voting rights. That's what Selma was all about, voting rights. And to get rid of this system of segregation, formal, legalized de jure segregation in the country. But once you've done that, he was saying, you're only at the start of the problem, because you have the inner city where there are no jobs, where there's crime, where there's drugs. You need, and he then had something called a freedom budget for America. And this was to rebuild the cities and to provide employment. It was, at the time, very expensive. It was almost $200 billion freedom budget. And for that, you need politics. You need to build a coalition.
And this was in the late 60s.
This is in the late 60s. And I can remember when I was a VISTA volunteer in Pittsburgh, he came through to promote the freedom budget in 1967. Little did I know I would end up working for him because he was my hero. I mean, when you end up working for your hero, that's pretty exciting. But unfortunately, things don't always work out, and the freedom budget was never adopted, and you had a backlash in the country. You had a backlash. A little bit like what we're seeing today, reverse wave. There are reactions against this, and there are reasons for those reactions. But at the same time, even though it didn't happen, it was still, this is, I believe, my own view, this is the most serious problem our country has, but there still has been progress. There still has been enormous progress, and you just have to continue to go forward.
Well, Carl, I think what you're talking about is the difficulty of consolidating a transition.
Exactly.
Once this breakthrough has happened, how do you really consolidate a transition? And I think that that's one of the key questions that the Biden-Harris administration, as you mentioned, they've made democracy support one of the centerpieces of their foreign policy agenda, but we haven't really seen any concrete policy proposals around that. So what should they be thinking about as they develop those proposals? What should they be thinking about in relation to transitions so that when we see places that are hopeful, like Tunisia, Sudan, Armenia, that they don't backslide, that we don't get a reverse wave there?
Look, corruption is obviously critical. And here the NED is positioned really to be very helpful. And it's not just the NED, because there's a lot an institution like AID can do, to help countries get their governance correct. NED works with non-governmental organizations, but Frank Fukuyama, who's was a long-time board member of the NED, kept referring, it's not just civil society, it's also the state. The state has to have good policies. The state has to be able to carry out services. The state has to be able to provide order in societies where there could be chaos. I mean, you can't have consolidation of democracy under these circumstances. And you need good economic policies. You need the rule of law. You need a free media. You need all of these things. And it has to be, a concentrated expansion to help democracy deliver. Because if it doesn't deliver, the opponents of this will take advantage of it and undermine the transition process. And we're very uneasy about Tunisia, that they've really got to have significant economic reform. And here, I'm happy to say, the NED is the only democracy institution in the world that has something like the Center for International Private Enterprise. And in a way, it was an afterthought. It was created because labor was so big, it needed business to balance it. But it has a remarkably important role. It's not a development institution. A lot of people don't understand it because they think once you deal with economics, it's all development. It's not democracy, but it's fundamentally democracy. And it's the interlinkage between democracy and a successful free market economy, a competitive free market economy that can provide economic growth for the country. And the fact that we have CIPE as part of the NED coalition and along with labor that can reach out to people who are marginalized, who are service workers, who are, migrant workers, who are unorganized workers whose rights are not being respected. The fact that you have these both institutions that can work together in some cases, and then along with the party institutes, so that these issues can enter into the political process. And you can have parties that actually develop agendas for reform, and it's not just built around personalities. This is a very, very difficult process. And if we've learned anything at the Ned over the time I've been there, it's how tough this is. I mean, when Frank Fukuyama wrote The End of History, it looked like liberal democracy was the future. And because there was no alternative. There was no alternative form of legitimacy. China is trying to create one right now.
I want to get to that.
Go ahead, but they're trying to create an alternative. But what we have learned is that this is not automatic. This is tough. Democracy is tough. I remember Chris Dodd once said that on the floor of the Senate when our bill was up, when we were about to be killed. He said, democracy is tough. And you need something like this to help people manage it properly.
Right. He was right. Okay, so for the past decade or so, authoritarian regimes such as China and Russia have been offering their model of governance as a superior to the sometimes messy and less orderly democracy that the United States espouses. So what makes you optimistic that democracy will indeed prevail in the world?
Look, I'll say one thing about Russia, but China's the big issue here. China's the big issue. Russia, as I said, is a declining power, and Putin is just hanging on. What I would hope that the United States would do would not only to be supporting the Democrats like Navalny in Russia, but also really helping this struggle in Belarus to succeed. Because if the struggle in Belarus can succeed, on top of the ongoing transition in Ukraine, on top of the transition that's now taking place in Moldova, which is quite remarkable under Maya Sandu.
She's really impressive.
She's terrific. And she wants, which has been a place where Russia has laundered its corrupt money, in Moldova. If Moldova becomes a democracy, that's extraordinary.
It's a huge deal.
And then you have Georgia. In other words, a lot of countries that were part of the former Soviet Union are moving. And eventually, Brzezinski always said this.
Even in some of the stands.
Even
in some of the stands.
It'll be tougher.
It's not
the process is moving.
Yeah.
The process is moving east. The process is moving east. Brzezinski always used to say, you can't have totalitarianism in Russia if Ukraine becomes a democracy. You can't have an imperial Russia, a totalitarian Russia, if Ukraine. And Tim Snyder said this many times. If Ukraine can become a real democracy, where a lot of the people speak Russian in addition to Ukrainian, Russians are going to say, why can't we have that? And if the countries in the vicinity of Russia, in the neighborhood of Russia, start making this transition, that's why Belarus is so important today. I think Russia can become democratic. But then just moving to China. Just a few weeks ago, July 1st, China, or I don't want to say China, the Chinese Communist Party, because I distinguish between China and the Chinese Communist Party. The party celebrated its 100th anniversary, and we had an event on that occasion. We had an evening event here because it was July 1st in China. And we brought together, with Larry Diamond moderating, 4 of our country's leading China scholars. Andy Nathan, who had been a member of the Ned Board of Columbia, Min-Jin Pei, who gave the Lipset lecture on our Lipset lecture on China, Chinese totalitarian system, Elizabeth Economy, who's got a brilliant article in the Foreign Affairs, and then Perry Link, who of all of, Perry has been incredibly close to people like Fang Lizhe and the other dissidents in China. They were all in agreement that this Xi system is too centralized and is not going to last. Perry Link made the remarkable point in this, and he's a historian. He said this regime under Xi Jinping reminds him of 2 earlier dynasties in China's history. One, the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Chen. A second, the Shui, which was the 7th century in the Common Era. The first one lasted 15 years. The second one lasted 37 years. And what were they? Highly centralized. They built the wall. They had massive corvée labor. They oppressed people, and they were aggressive toward their neighbors. And it didn't work. And they fell. And the feeling that all of them had is, don't look upon the Xi regime as if it's going to be there forever. Now look, China has taken COVID. I mean, look, it began in Wuhan. We know that. I'm not going to...
Yeah. Okay.
I have something I want to say about that,
Okay.
but let me start by saying that...
I'm trying to bail you out, Carl.
No, I want to get into this.
Okay.
They said that they're better at managing COVID because they are centralized. They can get people to do what they want. They can enforce social distancing and all of that. They're much better. And the democracies are very chaotic, as you say. They can't do anything. All of a sudden, here we are now. Chinese has these, this is not my word, it's Ben Sass's term. They have garbage vaccines. We have Moderna, we have Pfizer, we have Johnson & Johnson, we have the best vaccines. If we can vaccinate the world.
Amen.
Vaccinate the world. And China is sort of saying, here, we'll give you our garbage vaccines if you'll change your policy on Taiwan. No, we don't want that. We just want health. I mean, Latin America is being devastated. South Asia is being devastated by COVID. We want to improve the health of the world. We want to improve the economy of the world. And imagine if the U.S. did that, how that would change the narrative.
Amen.
And then on top of that, you have the lab leak. I don't think there is any credible thesis that has been offered other than a lab leak that was responsible for this virus starting in Wuhan. They had 2 virology labs. We know that there were very dangerous gain-of-function experiments taking place with U.S. support, by the way. That's one of the reasons we know this. Gain-of-function experiments taking place in these labs, certainly one of the labs, that was judged by our State Department in 2018 when we sent people to this lab, before all of this, to be unsafe. They were doing gain-of-function experiments in unsafe labs. And we now also know that before December, in November, there were 3 people in one of these labs that had COVID. That came out. And there are other things that have come out. Now, you'll never prove it because they've destroyed all the evidence, so you'll probably never prove it. But what's happening now is that, during the previous administration here, which tried to politicize the issue, nobody would associate themselves with this. But now, you're going to get a report coming to Biden and so forth. It's now becoming respectable. You've had articles, the Nicholas Wade article.
Yeah, serious people saying
Vanity
serious
Fair,
things.
serious, detailed research that is looking at this and say, what else is there? There's no evidence that it came from the wet market. And so, and a lot of democracies, the Wall Street Journal has written a lot about this, a lot of the democracies are very annoyed that China's not cooperating. It's a cover-up. Not only is it a cover-up, and there's no remorse for having given this to the world, they've used it as a cover to crack down in Hong Kong. They use it as a cover for their wolf warrior diplomacy because, the democracies are preoccupied with this. So there's a lot of unhappiness, And China, with its bulliness, is bullying Australia, bullying Sweden over different issues,
Canada.
I mean, it's more isolated now than we're aware of. And a lot of the countries are unhappy with it because they've destroyed the evidence. It's a cover-up. So even if we won't know completely, it's going to certainly affect their narrative. If the U.S. can vaccinate the world and this issue is going to remain there, the whole politics of the world could change.
I 100% agree. I think I told Elizabeth when we were having lunch a couple weeks ago, I have 5 takeaways from my 1,200 Zoom calls during COVID. I won't tell you all my 5 takeaways, but my 5th one is, what I tell folks is, there's going to be an Academy Awards of countries 3 years from now, or 2023, 2 years from now. Every country's going to stand up on a dais and give a speech, and they're going to give one of 3 speeches. I want to thank Vladimir Putin for solving my vaccine problem. I want to thank the great helmsman Xi Jinping for solving my vaccine problem, or I want to thank the United States of America and the West for solving my vaccine problem. I would really prefer that it's the 3rd speech that everyone gets up and gives, not the first 2.
It's not going to be the first 2 because we know from evidence
garbage vaccines
that countries like Chile, Mongolia, Seychelles, Bahrain, that have gotten...
They all want the good stuff.
No, they've gotten the Chinese
Yeah, they've
vaccine.
gotten the crap, now they
they've
want
got
them.
like 2/3 of the country, and they're among the top 10 countries where COVID is surging.
Terrible.
So it doesn't work. And here we have these wonderful vaccines.
We've got to flood the zone. I 100%
And
agree with you,
like,
Carl.
like the beginning of World War II, after Pearl Harbor, we have to treat it like that.
I agree. So, Elizabeth, I know we're coming to the end. Do you have any? I have a last question, but unless you have one for her.
No, please, go
Okay.
ahead, Dan.
So
I'm always
look,
doubting
okay,
you.
so- but Carl,
I'm not very confident.
Okay, Carl, so look, the last 18 months haven't been great. I've not been super happy about, being cooped up in my basement during COVID. But I'm generally an optimistic person, and I think I believe that if we take the grand scheme of the 40 years of the NED, we're still a freer, more prosperous world. Yes, there's been a significant democracy recession. You could even say it's an anti-wave. But I get the sense you're generally an optimistic person. What makes you optimistic for the future about the democracy movement?
I've thought about this a lot, Dan. If you're a policy person, you're always looking at our government's relations with the other government, and you're dealing with some really, really lousy governments in this world. And you'll say, well, there's nothing we can do with North Korea. There's nothing we can do with China. We may get conflict and war, and we have to take those things into account. I mean, this is really, really important stuff. But I don't approach the issues that way. When I go to Cuba or I go to North Korea, I'm sort of looking at what are the opportunities, what are the openings, how is the erosion happening? There are people we can support. That's what we did. You're always saying, what's the next step? And if you take that approach, which is different because the NED was separated from policy, separated from government, you can find opportunities. And what's remarkable about the world that we live in is that in every country there are these opportunities. I mean, when we found these opportunities in North Korea, and you start then even meeting people like Tae-young-ho or Ji-sung-ho, these people who've defected and are freedom fighters. Havel we once had one of these conferences in Prague, and Havel asked the delegation, who was being led by Reverend Benjamin Yoon, the one that started all of this on North Korea, he wanted to know about the dissident movement in North Korea, and Yoon said, there is none. I mean, because it was like, during Stalin's time in the Soviet Union. And Havel, when Havel got that, he wrote something about it, But eventually there will be these openings. You now have these markets, the Jangmadang, they're called. These are markets. The reason North Korea has been surviving is through the markets. The state distribution system broke down. So everywhere you can find people who start talking, who start thinking. And when they start thinking and talking and get information, what do they want? What do they want? They want dignity. It's not an abstraction called democracy. They want dignity. They want to be respected as people. And if they have a government that's oppressing them, that's stealing from them, they're going to be unhappy. They may not be able to speak out in the beginning, but eventually things develop over time. You have to have that hope that that's possible. And now, and I keep saying this, I said it to Elizabeth 1,000 times and to the staff, and she can tell you, how incredibly lucky we are to have an institution like that. Imagine this. And I tell people around the world, we use taxpayer money. When we support American values in the world, we're doing it with taxpayer money. Isn't that wonderful? Aren't we proud? Isn't America, with all of our problems, and boy do we have problems, aren't we a good country and a great country in the end? And I think that's what we're all about.
Carl, thanks for your service. Yeah, you're not finished. We need your voice still. You're going to be joining us. Hell no. And so Elizabeth and I are so happy you're joining CSIS as a senior advisor.
I've had a lot of friends here.
We need your voice. So thanks for all your service.
Thank you,
and
Dan.
we're so pleased.
Thank you, and thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
I think you can look back on your almost 40 years of service at NED and be really, really proud, and I hope you are.
There are a lot of good people in the world fighting very, very hard, and we're part of that struggle.
Amen. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.